Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Beautifully Broken podcast. We are joined with Dr. Elise all the way from Colorado. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Freddie. It's a pleasure to be here.
Honor to make the connection both through phone yesterday, but also the podcast. I will tell this story. I've referred a bunch of people to you because of your work as a terrain coach, the Metabolic Terrain Institute, which we've had Dr. Nasha on. People are familiar with the word terrain, but selfishly, I want to have you on, and I wanted to talk about what does a terrain coach do? Specifically, this Metabolic Terrain Institute. Like, what does that mean to somebody?
Yeah, this is a great question because I think it's not something that's talked about in the conventional cancer world at all. And so the metaphor that I really love to use with patients at the beginning is thinking about the body as a garden and cancer cells or tumors as the weeds. They pop up, left and right. And even if you cut the cancer cells off, pour chemo on it, radiate the tissues, the terrain, the soil is still the same. It's still going to generate the same things that it did before unless something changes. And so what we do with terrain work is going in and kind of excavating the soil and saying, okay, what are the genetics showing us? What nutrients are missing? What exposures or environmental toxicities are going on that are generating more weeds than flowers, so to speak? And so it's coming from a completely different direction, saying like, what is the environment and the condition to make healthy cells grow versus feeding cancer cells?
Great explanation.
Yeah.
And it makes so much sense to me.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not necessarily something, we're taught from little kids. It's like disease pops up as an unfortunate event.
Right. Because germ theory, oh, you're exposed to a germ, oh, you get sick. And there's no thought given to, oh, how is your immune system? How is your stress levels? What are your circadian rhythms doing? All of those factors.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And it's both true. They're both valid, right? There's times when, yes, germs do absolutely, in fact, impact large percentages of the population. But I'd say for context for the audience, the way in which that infection is expressed is very different from somebody who sits for 8 hours, lives on Diet Coke and Subway versus somebody who's very fit, active, has an understanding of a sleep hygiene protocol, all those things that we'd love to talk about on the show.
Yeah, absolutely. It's all about resiliency. How is our body actually responding, and are we equipping our bodies in a way that they're able to respond to things that are thrown their way? Because to be honest, all of us have cancer cells floating around. Probably anyone over the age of 17 probably has a few cancer cells floating around. And it's a matter of whether your body is actually kind of a fertile soil for them to land and spread and grow, and kind of how resilient all of the pieces are working together. So immune system function, hormone function, all of those beautiful parts that normally work together incredibly well. It's actually amazing that more of us don't have cancer, with how many times cells replicate over a lifetime.
Yeah. And cancer exists not just in people, but also in animals, in the wild, right? This is not, I know it's, now we could talk about cancer rates and the percentages of occurrence and how that's changed over time, specifically since the Industrial Revolution. But have you studied animal models and cancer and how that's different?
So yes, somewhat. I mean, are not necessarily in the lab, but you can look at overall trends. And it's a little different in humans because we're a much larger bodied species and we have a much longer lifespan than a lot of like the murine mouse models or smaller mouse models. There's only so many replications that a lifespan of, a year-long lifespan has versus when we're getting into like our 60s, 70s, 90s. And then there's just kind of a matter of chance almost of like the number of times that a cell and DNA mutates and divides, you're going to get a little bit more room for error on every single division. And so that's one element, is like we're a larger bodied species that lives much longer than we used to. And then you add in things like the Industrial Revolution and glyphosates and stress and kind of unnatural environments, and we start to see those rates go up and up and up. It is more rare in animals in the wild to see cancer rates that we see in humans. They're projecting in our lifetime like 1 in 3 to 1 in 2 people getting a diagnosis at some point. And so it's a little bit of an unfair playing field to completely compare to just like all the wild animals out there. And I don't have exact numbers off the top of my head, but it is
Sure.
more rare in the wild. But then you look at our domesticated animals, our cats and our dogs, and we see cancer rates that are matching humans. And they're getting diabetes and human diseases that aren't necessarily found in the wild. So
Yeah.
that's the part that I find a fascinating correlation there.
Yeah, I always just like to look at those things and just confirm my bias because we can romanticize, ancient man didn't deal with any of these things. And I
Mhm.
think they dealt with a much more severe scope of issues, like
Absolutely.
you were probably not valuable to society once you broke an ankle. You'd probably die.
Yeah, I heard a quote once from an old school chiropractor. He was like, yeah, your body's not designed to keep you pain-free for, 70 years. It's just designed to keep you alive enough to procreate. And then after
Yeah,
that, it doesn't matter as much to evolution. And so we're kind
yeah,
of at this cusp of facing a lot of change as a whole
yeah.
species. But I'd be curious to see, what have you seen in the cancer animal, world?
I would just mirror the same thing that from some of the holistic centers that care for and love animals just the same you and I would to a human being, that there's lots of poor education around what is healthy food for an animal.
Mm-hmm.
Specifically, I was just talking to a guest a couple months ago about the salivary glands and the enzymes that exist in a dog's mouth really are not ideal for breaking down carbohydrates. I started to say, oh, we give our dog really healthy food and there's vegetables. And she was like, pause there. So
Wow.
she just, she was saying, look, there's some things that are just we've passed on and we do. And so as a result of that, obviously they get the food supply that we do in a controlled environment that is not clean,
Mhm.
specifically, in factory farms. So
Yes.
she goes, it all depends. But yeah, and we were also talking about there's a great book out there. It's called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers.
I've heard of
And
this book.
the idea of like we're the only species, human beings, to worry ourselves into a malady, and pets are so intertwined with us and they pick up on our energy. And I don't know about
Absolutely.
you,
I know
but I've
some
seen
people.
anxious owners with anxious dogs.
Absolutely, absolutely. They're so sensitive. Their nervous systems are mirroring us, which is why they make such great support animals. And also, I think it affects them too. They're
Yeah.
in this right alongside of us.
Yeah, it's
Absolutely.
it's pretty wild. Why cancer terrain? What has driven you to want to work in this sandbox, this milieu of cancer, which is very complicated
Mhm.
and can be very heavy?
Absolutely. I mean, it's been a bit of a long and personal journey, in my own life. Not that I've had cancer, but I grew up with it very near and dear in my life. My mom was first diagnosed when I was about 12 with multiple myeloma, which is a cancer of the bone marrow. And we from there went on a very long, decades long journey where she's been diagnosed with 7 different cancers.
Mm,
And growing up, I'd always been interested in nutrition, and mentioning the pets. I had designed one of my dog's, diets when I was a kid because he had candida between his paws. But I hadn't necessarily been introduced to diet as a link with cancer until I was, much, much later. So as an athlete in undergrad, and then I decided to go to naturopathic med school. But even then, even though I knew the importance of nutrition, I was kind of shying away from the cancer world because it felt a little too close to home. I would
mm.
leave lectures because it felt so overly clinical and a little bit more like, wow, this is almost re-traumatizing in a way to see the statistics and the numbers. And, my mom's still with us. She's a miracle, walking miracle woman. But I started to see when she was at Mayo, they would give her the corn syrup shakes and just ensures to keep weight on her, but they weren't actually feeding her cells. And then I was introduced to Dr. Winter's work, and it was like the sun came up and it couldn't put it back down, where it connected all the dots for me between the environmental piece, my love for nature, my love for people, seeing how, if you don't change the conditions, the cancer will keep coming back. And I think that's something we see in a lot of people who've gone through conventional care, and we need conventional care sometimes. Like, I'm the first one to say, like, it saved my mom's life. It's the reason she's still here with me today. And we are always doing the work to kind of clean up her terrain now, to give her the best possible chance to prevent a reoccurrence. And so it kind of weave together all the threads of my own personal journey of caring very, very deeply, and also seeing like, okay, this is all connected. We can't separate this from health, on a very, very simple and a very beautiful level. And I just, love thinking about the cancer terrain, because it's so complex and endless learning for me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's really, oh man, it's you could I could go down a rabbit hole. I wonder, is your mom someone, because there's always a unique dynamic with family members,
Mm-hmm.
and having an area of expertise, sometimes that's
Absolutely.
like a touchy area. Does your mom allow you to support her and guide her and help her with her terrain?
Yes, not to the extent that I probably would be involved with one of my full-time clients and patients, but she is always learning alongside me and open. So it's a work in progress, definitely. But part
Yeah.
of it is just living my own life and saying, hey, this is what I do in my home to kind of clean up, the terrain of my home and what I don't allow in my home and how I'm eating. Can I cook you a meal? And so a lot of it for us has highlighted a lot of relational pieces there, where it can just be like, can it just be more love, between us,
Yeah.
how we nourish each other. Because yes,
Beautiful.
you're right, that can be very tender. And we've hit a few little nerves there where it's like, ooh, you're not doing, what I know to be true. And we have to maintain like the daughter-mother relationship first. And
Yeah.
oftentimes, they say, don't try to treat your family members. So
Yes.
she's not
Yeah.
in active cancer anymore. So thank gosh, we don't have
Yeah.
to, be in the deep end at this very moment in time.
Beautiful.
Yeah, would
Beautiful.
probably refer
And
out. Hmm.
refer out, you said.
Yeah, probably refer out.
Yeah.
Hmm.
I think that's
Hmm.
probably healthy. When you look at the field, as the time you've been in, and again working as a terrain coach, have you seen anything change as far as cancer rates, who you're seeing, the type of client you're seeing?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things, you and I were talking about yesterday is age. Just the young people who are showing up in my office. I have young women who are in their late 20s who have diagnoses of cancer, early 30s, GI cancers and breast cancers. And it astounds me because, these cancers we used to be seeing in people who are 50s, 60s. And that's kind
Yeah.
of the normal, not
Hmm.
normal, not to say that any cancer is normal, but that's almost what we would more expect as a demographic. But I think when it's actual environmental diseases or hormonal, detoxification pathway type cancers that are showing up in my office at a very, very young age, I start to, my wheels really start spinning as far as environmental toxins and how do we, reverse the train a little bit and move the engine in the opposite direction. Because, the risk of recurrence with somebody who's so young, over the next couple decades, we almost have to double down on our work to prevent that. So I
Yeah.
have one young lady who has lymphoma, and she's I think she's 31, but she was in the military. And so it was like, we have to do a toxicant panel on you because we don't know what you were exposed to in your time serving. And so we're waiting on those results right now. I'm really excited to see what we find. But
Yeah.
oftentimes I do go looking and I will find things, on the terrain labs, and then we get to work. So,
Yeah. And
mhm.
so can we talk about what some of those terrain labs could look like? What are some
Yeah. Mhm.
snapshots of the body and the terrain and metabolic function that you like to look at?
Totally. So, I mean, right off the top of my head, we talk about angiogenesis, so new blood vessel formation. And so this goes on a couple different levels with, cancer likes to change its own terrain, and it kind of creates this cool little encapsulation if we're talking about tumors rather than systemic cancers. And it creates its own little environment where it's like, ooh, I need some nutrients and I need all the sugar I can get, but it kind of blocks itself off from the normal vasculature of the system that's flowing. So it creates its own vasculature. And so we can start to see, both markers for angiogenesis as well as potential metastatic markers. So fibrinogen, for example, where the blood gets thicker in a certain areas. Well, it's thicker in the whole body, but it's causing this hypoxia formation, but also the stickiness of the blood creates a scaffolding where cancer cells can start to move around the building. And so when we can start to address certain things like that, or immune system function. So I always look at the neutrophil to lymphocyte ratio. And so we want this to be about a 1:1 to 2:1 ratio, which is much tighter ranges than like a typical abnormal on blood work. But what this shows me is that sometimes if somebody's been overtreated with chemotherapy, or if their immune system isn't functioning and it's been kind of depleted in a really severe way, their immune system has stopped its normal surveillance. And so we can see this bone marrow suppression, which triggers the potential for future cancers down the line. So we want to start to wake back up and rebalance that immune system so that it starts to do its job. Other elements to the terrain, big one is metabolic health. This is one that's kind of, I harp on day and night, and, cancer cells do change their metabolic function. And this is, it turns off the mitochondrial function. And you've heard this over and over and over, Freddie, I'm sure. But they've lost the ability to use ketones as fuel. They can only use glycolysis, which is like the quick breakdown of sugars as fuel. And so we talk about the hybrid engine of cells, and our normal cells can switch back and forth between both types of metabolism. But cancer cells have lost that ability. And so when we put them in a more restricted environment with like fasting and ketones and more ketogenic diets, they start to hit a wall. And especially when you combine that with therapies like chemo or radiation, they uptake that at a faster rate. And, people have much, much, much better outcomes when it comes to conventional care. So there's just a few little drops in the bucket that we can start to see on labs. There are these areas that we can fine tune. There's many, many, many more. There's microbiome, inflammatory markers, things like that we start to peel back the layers and look at very individually for each person.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When you work with someone, do you have an essentials or a non-negotiable list that you like to have to get a complete picture?
Yeah, I do. I can't list the whole list right now because it's about
No, that's okay.
pages long. But yeah, for basic blood work, basic. Some people come to me with they're like, oh, I had lab work done by my oncologist, and it's like just to see if CBC and CMP, and I'm like, well, that's cute, but let's run the full panel here. So yeah, for most of the people that I work with, we run a pretty comprehensive onboarding panel right at the beginning as like a baseline. And then from there, every month we rerun and you start to build this cool graph where we can actually see trends. Like, ooh, we did this and that lab marker dropped. Or, oh, we pushed a little too hard and this oxidative marker is coming up. We might need to back off the vitamin C therapies, things like that. And so people really start to get an idea of like, okay, when I eat this way, we can see my inflammatory markers coming down. And so I find it's really helpful for people to put this together. And then even when somebody's in quote unquote remission, we still want to run some of these markers on a regular basis so we can start to see if things start to kind of drift in the wrong direction, which is pretty cool. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really, I hope everybody that hears this podcast can just pause here. And I hope everybody can feel like there is such a difference between it's really hard because I want, this term, do your own research. It's like, good luck, good luck finding now, when I started this in 2006, it was a totally different space. There wasn't we hadn't really gotten into this influential model of people giving out information online. And there's just so many opinions out there today. I really want people to hear like the value of working with someone with a health matrix, a functional matrix in which you're pulling statistical data, you're creating a framework, and you can visualize how the patient is or is not moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's so different than a wing and a prayer. And again, if you're talking to a clinic or saying, we're going to do a 2-week detox for you and it's $20, $30, $40,000, I hope everybody can just pause. And maybe we can talk a little bit about, these timelines. Like, this isn't a week or a year. This is like this is the life game. We're going to do this for life. And when we have these, we can use the person without giving a name or a context, but the person you're working with in the military, it's very likely, I have a friend who was his assignment was being near burn piles. And so he's on a list of, like, they call him every 6 months. Do you have cancer yet? Great. Do you have this cancer? Do you have this symptom? Have your lungs done this yet? Nope. And then they hang up the phone.
That is wild.
They're just checking in and they're saying, this dude is very likely to have one of these things expressed. Now, he's doing a lot of stuff to manage his metabolic health as well as he can. But this is the context that it really does takes time. And if the military is calling every 6 months waiting for these things to happen, I promise you, they know something about there's a knowledge about the terrain, right?
Absolutely.
That this stuff matters. So it's the scope, it's the timeline. It's like, you're doing it with a terrain coach because you have a workable framework.
Yeah. And this is where I've been so grateful for, both my medical training, but also the additional kind of pieces afterwards and more of like the biohacking world and the conferences and everything that's kind of cutting edge, because med school tends to be a little bit behind. But when you can marry and blend those worlds together and then put it in like you said, the matrix, like a framework that's going to hold somebody through the 6 months after a diagnosis, the year after, the 5 years after, the 10 years after, or for someone like this person in the military, even before a diagnosis, can we do all the things to not even get there? But having an understanding of like, this is understanding like the momentum of cancer or the momentum of where the cells are going in the body. And I really do think we have a lot more information and autonomy and empowerment than we would be given to think, rather than just like a wait and watch approach. Or like so many patients are kind of, oh, you're in remission. And their oncologist is like, okay, we'll see you in a year for your checkup. And they're just kind of tossed out into the abyss. Like, cool, you're cancer free. Now what? And they're not oftentimes given like an aftercare plan. Like, now what? A post-treatment plan. How do we actually rebuild your body from the damage that was done? And I think that's a conversation that's not often had in the mainstream, cancer world. The longevity people get it. They're talking about prevention and, telomere length and all of that stuff on a day-to-day basis. But once you're already at that turning point, having a very concrete, plan moving forward can be a game changer for a lot of people.
Yeah. And
there's so many layers. I mean, you can go look on Reddit and, find things, but unless you've been kind of putting together the strategy and the pieces for years, it can be so overwhelming. And so I like to say, like, I'll do the strategy, bring me your questions, and then, I'll create the game plan for you.
Yeah.
And being open to all things, not shutting anything down. You want a very open-minded, team on your side. Yeah.
Yeah. It's what I love doing. I love I'm the most happiest when A, on stage, I'm speaking to people, and then B, working in a fashion of not prescribing or I'm not treating. I'm truly acting as I say wellness concierge, because I am, unlike you, I'm not a medical doctor, but I will listen and I will, with unbiased discernment, I'm pretty good at least I'm connecting with people like you. I'm like, listen, I hear everything you're saying is good. The missing piece is like this framework, or the framework's really good. What I think you could really benefit from is, it sounds like you're really struggling with cellular voltage or lymphatic drainage, or it sounds like you're really struggling with, some type of a thing to rejuvenate the body after this trauma. Maybe that's a hyperbaric chamber, right? So then we can get into the nuance and, again, be able to pull some of the marketing out and give people an actionable plan. But I really appreciate that. And it's just more and more, for me, it's become more difficult to get information offline. I mean, even let me give you one other example, which I'm sure you could probably join with me. I just wrote this article yesterday because people were asking me about a B vitamin supplement. I was saying, oh, here it is from Thorne, and do this. And my partner and said, "Oh, I noticed you're out of this one product from Cellcore." And she's like, "I got it for you." I was like, "Where'd you get it?" She's like,
Mm.
"Amazon." I was like,
Mhm.
"Cool." And so I get this bottle showing up and I open it and it's like the label is clearly photocopied. I open it up, the pills are red. They're supposed to be like this smoky brown with like a humectant fulvic acid. I was like, "Babe, this is
Nope.
not." She was like, "How
Yeah.
do you know?" I was like, "No, I know the pill. I know the smell." I'm like, weird like that.
It's a wild world we're living in right now. Do not get your supplements on Amazon, please. Go
We
through
we
either
have a whole podcast coming out.
tested. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it's I think it was near 60% of the quality controlled where pills were pulled from shelves and tested. I think 60% passed. Whereas everything else,
Wow.
not that it wasn't real, it had additional items. Some had
Fillers.
things like Cialis, proton pump inhibitors, other chemicals that would cause an effect in the body, so you'd feel something, but nothing to do with the product or the claim. And it's like a wild west of flea markets.
Yep. Yep. Absolutely. Yeah. So go through a trusted source, please, 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 for
Yeah.
supplements.
Yeah, we have a whole, and I will also say I'm totally do it once in a while, but you look for the right storefront, you look for the
Mhm.
vendor, you look direct from company, you look from GMP stamps. It's
Absolutely.
interesting. I see a big overhaul coming from that platform just because there's so much fraud on it right now. It's really interesting.
That's a really, really good point. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I use full script or also go directly through companies. And it's kind of a pain sometimes because you're going through all these different, sources, but they're direct from, the labs themselves, which is the way you want to go.
That's right.
Especially in the cancer world, because you don't have enough wiggle room to mess around. Like if you're just kind of trying to fix your GI health a little bit or whatnot, it's not going to cause a detriment. But if there's extra additives in a terrain that's already overly inflamed and already low on nutrients, we don't have a lot of wiggle room to play with.
Yeah.
So yeah, I just get really wary when people are like, "Oh, I saw this thing advertised on Instagram and I bought it," and I'm like, "Oh no, I wish you had asked me first."
I had a buddy that just went at like
Really good.
$500 in on peptides and a nasal spray, and I was like, "Oh, buddy." I was like, we can go right to the company. I have two companies. We can just go right. It can be pure. It can be lab pure. We can actually,
Right.
and I think the risk is for me, you're going to get a person out there who's like, oh, maybe they were just trying to support their adrenal glands and, do some type of like a precursor to sleep. If every time you do a failure, you like you lose a little faith in the system.
Mhm.
So I'm such a huge fan of full script, and I know you can set a discount, you get direct from the
Mhm.
company. It's actually very quick shipping.
Yeah, very quick shipping. And this brings up actually a really good point. In today's day and age where we can just research anything at our fingertips, like what's good for adrenal health. That's where it's really awesome to have people who are on your team kind of in your back pocket. You can ask because it's like things like ashwagandha. Amazing for adrenal health sometimes for certain people, but I
Yeah.
would never advise someone with a hormone sensitive cancer to take ashwagandha. And I've had people come to me who have breast cancer and that's like in their list of things they're taking. I'm like, we're going to get rid of this. We're going to get rid of this. We're going to get rid of this because you're directly sensitizing or like stimulating estrogen receptors, in the cell tissue types. And so
Yeah.
it's things like that that you don't necessarily know on face value when you're kind of looking for things, online that may have great health benefits, but not for you,
Yeah.
in context, in terrain.
Yeah. Yeah. So important.
Yeah.
So important. Methylcobalamin, B vitamins,
Mhm.
depending on, are you a person who's going to have a genetic SNP, which that drives mania and anxiety?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah.
B
Go
vitamins
to
can
a
be
pro.
life changing for some people and also can really push you over the edge. And
Yeah.
B6, with cancer patients, it's strongly contraindicated because it can stimulate certain pathways and cell growth
Yeah.
cycles that we don't want to actually stimulate more cell growth. And so
Yeah.
these little nuances,
Yeah.
it takes a while for the brain to learn and hold all of that. So we have
Yeah.
brilliant, brilliant practitioners all over. And
Yep.
everybody has a slightly different lens that they come at things with, but
Mm-hmm.
choosing somebody that people feel really, that they can trust, that they can have open questions and conversations and dialogues with, people who are staying up to date on the research, who have teams of their own consultants to ask questions. I think,
Yes. People are doing case studies,
absolutely.
doing
Mhm.
roundtables with other doctors and practitioners
Mhm.
on hard cases.
Yeah, yeah. That's one of the beautiful things that Dr. Winters has set up, is like there's a whole network of practitioners that we all communicate to each other. Hey, I have this case. This one's really complex. I have them on this and this. Like, what else have you guys seen? What am I missing? And so it's really awesome to get like the hive mind going on it, the mycelial network.
Yes.
Everybody knows something a little bit different.
Yeah, it's so wild. It's so wild. I'm so what do I want to say? I'm so timid with my recommendations around anyone trying anything anymore. I'm even, it's putting together this big terrain course. I was like, I mean, I think I'm just going to stick to like things like herbs and milk thistles and just teas and, gentle supportive, but mostly lifestyle, mostly movement, manual lymphatic drainage, mostly sleep hygiene, mostly like the hormetic stressors of exercise. That even me with, I skip stuff that I was like, God, the ROI on a fasting mimicking diet. I was just looking at I was just doing this analysis of like where does the GLP-1 exceed like expectations, and what happens with a 5-day fasting mimicking diet. And one's $12,000 a year and one's $150 a year.
Right.
But the fasting mimicking, it's like, not only do you do get benefit, you do get weight loss, you do get a higher reduction of visceral fat, longer telomere length from the science existing, but you also don't lose muscle mass. It's really interesting, like with this portion of the population who's already overweight, and we're just not talking about quality control. We just want to diminish what's coming in. The math for me has always sounded really bad on a GLP-1 as an intervention because of the incomplete conversation around terrain.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I mean, you're reminding me of like some of the old school naturopathic doctors. Like they were like, the doctors are light, grounding, cold water, fresh air, good diet, and going back to the absolute basics. And not saying that that's going to just like cure everything, but I think if we took most people and took them out of their toxic environments and put them out in the countryside somewhere where they were walking barefoot and growing their own food and like getting the basics of sunlight in their eyes and circadian rhythms, going back to those very foundational nature cure, we say vis medicatrix naturae, the Latin for, the healing power of nature. And the body has such an incredible wisdom, with apoptosis and DNA repair, that if you just kind of make some subtle shifts, fasting mimicking diets, or, a water fast for a couple days, with support, if that's appropriate for you, but your body starts to reorganize its own intelligence around that. And it's like, do we always need drugs, for weight loss? It's something that the body is actually going to do even better in a lot of ways. Possibly. So I always like to balance, the cutting edge and like what's the newest, coolest, most exciting thing with like, okay, can we just like go for a walk? And that's going to move our lymphatic drainage too, red light therapy and red light panels, or a little bit of healthy sun. So it's definitely a nuanced balance there.
Yeah.
But the body is incredible.
It's incredible. It's incredible in its ability to self-correct if we allow it to. How do you incorporate the energetics and the emotional intelligence of the body into your practice?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, first of all, I meet people where they are, because not everybody is quite yet ready to take on that whole piece of their life. But, it can be as simple as morning pages, writing out and noticing our own thought patterns. Like, where are the beliefs that we're stuck in, as far as like, woe is me, nothing's ever going to get better, I'm not going to shift into health. And where can we shift that? Doing like visualizations. I think some people resonate with Joe Dispenza's work, some people don't, but some of the leaps that he makes as far as visualizing states of being, saying, I am, this vibrant health source of life, and shifting into that state rather than the messaging that our cells get, because they don't understand the difference between running from the bear and kind of self-depreciating thoughts, as on a cellular level. Our cell danger response is very similar. And so I start off with people with just conversations of like, how's your relationship with your body? How's your relationship in your life with those that you love, with work? Like, how satisfied are we? And then from there, if we want to take off more chunks, we have conversations around, somatic processing, like what's stored in the body, from childhood, things that aren't necessarily logical. We can do the talk therapy all day long and still not, you can move the dial a little bit, but sometimes actually moving the body in its own wisdom, again, back to wisdom of the body, can be hugely profound for people.
Yeah.
A lot of people are leaning a little bit more into like psychedelic integration therapy, things that can kind of speed up the timeline and like unlock things in the body and the emotional body and say, whoa, like that was there from when I was 7. And, that's not something that I necessarily work with people with, but I have, referred out, and people have been like, had amazing breakthroughs, and just seeing the integration on the other side and being able to walk forward in their life saying, wow, I let that go, forgiveness. And so for each person, different things are going to resonate with them. But somatic therapy is one that I've seen a huge benefit with. Emotion code is another one. Liberate is a good community that a lot of people have gone to help identify specific little beliefs, specifically in cancer patients. They have a really awesome program, and they've done some digging and seeing some patterns across the board for a lot of cancer patients is the belief of, I'm not seen, I'm not worthy. And so this inability to like use our voice in the world and starting to take baby steps to be seen a little bit more in those places that are scary for each of us to be witnessed in. And I think sometimes witness comes alongside, that healing process. So,
yeah. Can I ask you how do you work with that medicine for yourself?
For myself,
to be seen. Yeah.
That's such a good question.
Have your voice out there.
Wow. I mean, this podcast is a piece of it. But part of my journey in the last couple of years has actually been working in a really beautiful women's container. And part of that has been singing in front of people and actually kind of sharing songs that I've written. And so using that kind of voice that was maybe squashed when I was, young, of like the fear of messing up and that perfectionist, and saying, okay, so what? What if somebody sees me, making a mistake, and still having people who've walked through that journey alongside me saying like, we love you anyways, Elise, like keep going, you've got this. And each time it gets, the grip gets a little bit looser, a little bit more spacious. So, it's never like we're completely fixed and healed, but you can feel those shifts. And each time it gets a little bit easier. And so being in your creative, can be massive. And something that a lot of us are afraid to be seen in.
Yeah, so therapeutic. Art and self-expression is so therapeutic for me.
Absolutely. Yeah. And
so therapeutic.
People who like you really resonate with and trust, and having good guides along the way.
Yeah. I would love to ask you, in this field of optimization, health optimization, and longevity, are there any technologies that you think people are really getting it right with, that have a good that transfer over to the oncology terrain space very well?
Let me think about that one. I mean, things like specifically longevity wise.
Well, things from that space that would transfer and really support somebody that is trying to upregulate their terrain to have a better experience with cancer.
I mean, the thing that we've already kind of touched on is fasting. I think the longevity community, they were looking at, mouse models and also human models, and seeing, even a 70% decrease in daily caloric intake and a much larger increase in lifespan than, supplementing, different things, antioxidants and whatnot. And so in the human space, when we're in a fasting mode, obviously like with support, if detoxification methods, pathways are open and optimized, we see, shifts in telomeres, in kind of overall vitality, in the way that our bodies or our hunger hormones actually shift from before and after, and stay there after for a prolonged amount of time. And so I think that this is almost a lost wisdom in modern day society. If you look across the board at so many different religious groups, so across the world, there's been some sort of fasting that's incorporated into human cycles, and we've lost a bit of that understanding of like deep, deep, deep rest, both on a GI
Mm.
level, on a, emotional level where we're not going out and doing all day long, like kind of going a little bit more introspective and allowing the body to go through and clear out any sort of tissues and cells that are not functioning optimally anymore. And so that's a good one. That's a really basic one. Low dose naltrexone, I feel like, is one that keeps coming up as far as immune system modulation and apoptotic effects with such a good safety profile as well. So across the board from autoimmune diseases, but also in the cancer space, that one's, quite frequently and quite safely used.
Their compounding pharmacy, the really good one, it's out in Colorado, yes?
Mm-hmm. Which one?
Oh God, they've been on the podcast, but it was like 100 episodes ago.
It's not coming to me off the top of my head.
That's okay. Let me see if I can find it while we're chatting.
Things like methylene blue,
Yeah.
that's, they've kind of been going back and forth on that one, in some of the spaces as far as whether it's, causing people's brains to turn blue, but in the cancer space, with the RAS pathways and, promoting mitochondrial rejuvenation, that sort of thing. So that's one of the big intersections between the longevity world and the cancer world, is that the mitochondria and promoting that kind of cellular energy space.
It was Belmar Pharmacy.
Belmar, yes, have heard of them. Yes.
Yeah. It's that's so funny. I played around with LDN like from like 8 years ago.
Oh, did you?
I've been on and off of it. It's really interesting. For me, it's very, very sensitive to things disrupting my sleep, and that one always made me. It facilitated a very like lucid dreaming state. I never felt like I was sleeping.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Vivid dreams are a very common initial side effect.
Yeah.
Sometimes it starts to go away, but some people
They say that. Yeah. That's so interesting. Is there, when you're looking at things like LDN, and the other thing I wanted to go back to is you mentioned if drainage pathways are open, fasts can be, that maybe they check a little more of a beneficial column. What do you mean by that when you're saying if drainage pathways are open?
That's a great question. So when the body goes into a fasting mode, if you think about all the powerhouses kind of settling down into almost a more sleeping state, the cells start to stop turning their cycles as quickly because there's no energy coming in, no calories coming in. They're like, oh, it's like hibernate. And so with that hibernation, oftentimes the cellular pathways that are either promoted for detoxification or for cellular energy production slow down as well. And because we're not getting the minerals coming in to turn, the wheels, so to speak. And so the body is trying to go and clear out, different cells that are maybe, on their way to apoptosis. It can stimulate that apoptosis, but we need to actually help to clear those out and send them out of the body. And also, digestion stops as well. When we're in a longer fast, everything just kind of goes into a hibernation state. So what I oftentimes recommend for people is being on something like Beam Minerals, some kind of fulvic and humic acid, to actually keep those little cycles going, keep the minerals on board so that not everything comes to a complete standstill. Also doing things like, enemas during cleanses or fasts to kind of keep the toxic waste from accumulating in the bowel system. So keeping the liver going with a coffee enema, things like that, castor oil packs, so that not everything comes to a standstill. And so there's a little bit of preparation work also going into this. People probably shouldn't just jump straight into a 3 or 5 day fast without doing a little bit of prep work, making sure, okay, liver enzymes are working well. Like I've been, having good elimination on a daily basis. Kidney health is really good. All of those areas that detoxification happens, and probably saunaing on a daily basis as well, because the skin is our largest detoxification organ. So again, looking at the pathways, the SNPs pathways, and kind of where each person has their own, enzymes that are either functioning or a little bit slower on the functioning pathways, and how we can support those before jumping into something like a longer term, water or prolonged fast, something like that.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Does that
Awesome.
help to answer that a little bit?
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. No, I just, everybody explains it in a different way. And I just always, I'm interested how people navigate that conversation. I'm certainly a drainage pathway is open first to
Hmm.
be sure we're
Yeah.
prepared for, what the body might be ready to release, both
Yeah.
energetically and from how have I framed my day? Have I overscheduled myself on the low caloric burden, still
And
having to do life, and that I find can set someone into a severe sympathetic spiral.
absolutely, because you don't have the spaciousness to actually digest what needs to digest and
Yeah,
release what needs to be released. I love that you bring up kind of the energetic imprint of what fasting is
yeah,
supposed to be a slowdown. It is supposed to be a deep rest that we're not necessarily getting on a day-to-day basis.
yeah,
Yeah, and there's so many levels to detoxification, and especially in, the cancer world, some people are like, okay, dim, for estrogen overload, but in breast cancer, specifically, but that's not enough if your phase 2 and phase 3 elimination pathways aren't also open, because then we're just transmuting. Okay, sure, it's a less potent form of estrogen, but then it's still getting reuptaken by the GI system if we haven't fixed the microbiome, if we haven't fixed, where bile is flowing, and, all of those other little pieces along the way.
yeah,
And as well as like COMT and the pathways that our body really needs to be able to process everything beautifully
yeah,
and let go.
yeah. It's
Yeah.
such good information.
Yeah.
I have always heard, just to do one more topic on fasting, and I've heard and I've read different articles that have been anecdotal, and I've I've never found anything unbelievably concrete. But from
Mhm.
my understanding, it makes so much sense from a neurocellular protective standpoint, leading into chemotherapy or leading
Mhm.
into radiation, that a 24 to 48-hour fast could theoretically be highly beneficial.
Yeah.
Um, there's a few things that I will print out because a lot of times, again, working as a concierge, when that's happened in the past, I'm I need to give people things to hand to their oncologist or their practitioner to say, hey, are you okay with this? I want you to be on board with this. You're the person who is. I am under your medical care.
Mhm.
Um, what's your understanding about fasting as a practice leading into a standard of care treatment? And I know
Yeah.
it will be nuanced depending on the cancer and the person and their strength and rigidity and whatnot.
Absolutely. This is so, so, so important. I'm really glad you brought this up. So kind of what I was saying earlier with ketosis and ketogenic diets, cancer cells have lost that ability to have the dual engine in a way, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so when we take away cancer's fuel, which is kind of our daily, diet eating, cancer cells don't have the option to go into fatty acid metabolism. They don't have the option to like feed off of ketones. And so if we are able to shift the rest of our body into that state where we're able to operate on a fairly normal basis in ketosis, cancer cells they're extra hungry. They're like, oh my gosh, I need fuel. I'm running out of fuel. I'm out of glycogen in the system. And then if you give a dose of chemo or radiation, those cells are going to say, they're going to suck that up on a much faster rate, while the rest of your cells are almost in like a little bit of a relaxed, a little bit more of that hibernation state. So they're not uptaking the chemo as intensely, as effectively as the cancer cells themselves. It like hypersensitizes them to the dose that's coming in. And so what I oftentimes see, if an oncologist is open to it, is can we get away with a little bit of a lower dose of chemo if the cancer cells are hypersensitized because they're uptaking it at a faster rate? So
Mm-hmm.
things like metronomic chemo, or even like minimal effective dose, where it's not like the maximal dose that's like almost going to kill someone, but like just enough to really get in there, do its job, and then get out, and then do some of the recovery and repair with like magnesium baths, and pull it out of the system, in a gentle way. Let it do its job. We don't want to undo what it's doing, but do some of the repair in between, sessions that are every 3 weeks or so, depending on the cancer.
Yeah.
And so similar for radiation, there are certain things we can do, curcumin, things on board that actually will sensitize the cancer cells to radiation, especially when combined with fasting.
Yeah.
Yeah,
The
so it's
the
really
last thing Yeah, I mean, I know it's contextualized. I just want to say that for everybody at home, this is not prescriptive in any way. And
No, no. Yeah, I would
you,
highly recommend working with somebody who knows the timing and what else to bring on board and what symptoms to watch for and all of that to do it safely.
if this conversation that we're having, and it's all, different people listen to this podcast from all over the world. I think we're in like 35 different countries,
Oh, wow.
and everybody knows somebody going through cancer at this time. If this, it's and the stuff we're having conversation, which is quite grounded and rooted in science that for the most part we can recreate. Will there be a time in the future where places like the Mayo Clinic and MD Anderson and Mount Sinai start to incorporate some of these terrain practices and, better? I want to say better, like better offboarding once treatment is done. Do you think?
I really, really hope so. I do really hope so. And I think a lot of oncologists are catching up to some things that have been in the, more alternative sphere for a while. A lot of them don't necessarily have time to spend, with every
That's
single
valid.
patient going forward. But a lot of them, especially with Mayo and some of the bigger cancer care clinics, they already have alternative programs along the side where it's like you can go get a sound bath, you can go speak to a nutritionist.
Yeah.
Again, they're still catching up on putting together the full picture of
Yeah.
terrain support. Dr. Seyfried has a really awesome lecture where he talks about, the press pulse therapies and ketogenic diets combined with different off-label therapeutic drug uses. And he's like, they will catch up because they have to eventually, because all the research has been going into cancer as a genetic disease. Like which genetic mutation do I have that gave me cancer that my parents have? And he's like, his focus, Dr. Seyfried's focus is all on cancer as a metabolic disease and a mitochondrial, malfunctioning disease. And he's like, once they start to recognize that those mutations are actually affecting the cellular environment, eventually they'll have to catch up because, they can keep treating the cancer, but until we actually shift, the body, the numbers are just going to keep going up as far as diagnosis rates over time. And so I'm sure you've heard of the study where they took cancer cell DNA and put it in a healthy cell, and the cell stayed healthy even though it had cancerous DNA, and vice versa. They took, an unhealthy, kind of junk cell and put healthy DNA in it, and it continued to grow into cancer. And so that's, on a micro level, one of the examples is like, it's not just genetics. And oftentimes we're treating just the genetics. Or, the immunotherapies do have a lot of promise coming out, but I hope they can combine it with the full terrain approach eventually.
Yeah.
And you look at, clinics in Germany, like 80% of patients in the EU and Germany are getting combinations with like mistletoe. So actually supporting the terrain of the body to turn back on its normal surveillance. That is not common practice in the US because there's just not a lot of money there. So it's
Can we talk about mistletoe therapy a little bit?
Sure, absolutely.
And we I think we scratched on it when Dr. Nasha was on, but what is mistletoe therapy and why do they use it in Germany?
Yeah, so mistletoe is a really, really cool plant. If you look at the trees growing in the wild, it's almost like there's a tumor ball growing in the tree. It's like a parasitic type of plant. But this plant just tends to be really high in certain lectins and certain immunostimulatory components. And so in the way it's used in Germany and some parts of the US, it can either be subcutaneous or IV injection. And these components go and turn on different parts of the immune system that maybe have been lost or aren't functioning very well. So natural killer cells. It helps to reduce inflammatory cytokines, IL-6 and IL-1, starts to activate macrophages more effectively. And then the other really cool thing is that it starts to turn up our internal body temperature just a little bit, kind of micro degrees. And cancer really doesn't like warm cellular environments. It actually, if you look at areas, it's actually cool, kind of around, areas, where cancer really likes to thrive. And so when we're kind of stimulating like a very, very, very low level, like micro fever in a way. And so in addition to this immune system response, And so a lot of people, it's not necessarily a stand-in treatment. Like you're not going to do this instead of chemo, but it can help to come alongside chemo to maybe improve outcomes, to reduce pain. And then what I like to do is beyond treatment, maybe once a quarter, do some dosing to remind the body, say, hey, body, let's look around and survey the tissue, survey the terrain with your own immune system for any little lingering cancer cells that were left behind that we all probably have. And so it's a really cool mechanism of a plant that's, it's been in Druid lore and used as, in kind of rituals for centuries. But it's a really cool, almost like metaphor plant when we look at how it grows in the wild and what it treats in the body. We call it kind of the law of similars in a way, where we kind of see that fingerprint from nature showing up as what it's offering to us in the medical landscape. And so that's a little bit more like woo and out there, but one of the ideas behind mistletoe is that it's helping the body integrate into self more effectively. Whereas you can think of cancer cells as, one cancer cell is kind of isolating and it's removing itself from the whole and kind of becoming its own little community over here. And it's not actually working synergistically with the whole. And, mistletoe is one of those ways we can say, hey, body, let's remind that, this isn't other, this is still self. Let's bring everything back into harmony. So, but, some really cool science around it is actually probably one of the most highly researched plants. There's probably the most studies out there on any plant is mistletoe.
And I remember, I think my chemotherapy etoposide cisplatin was probably like, I think it was $19,000, $20,000 a week, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
What is a round or a protocol of mistletoe? What are the price ranges for something like that for a patient?
Yeah, definitely not 19,000. A box trends anywhere from like 100 to 150, and that'll last somebody about a month. Supply.
Oh, wow.
So much more effective as far as financial cost. And again, it's not necessarily going to replace the cisplatin, but again, for like long-term care, kind of helping somebody prevent a relapse potentially, or getting somebody through with fewer rounds or, minimal effective dose type situations. Great. So there's a lot more, wiggle room and room to play, so to speak, when we bring all of the layers synergistically together rather than just like one single drug at a time.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Amazing. I want to be respectful of your hour.
Thank you.
And time and also people at home listening to this. I definitely want to have you back on the podcast if you'd come back, because there's so many different things
we could. From you, Freddie, already.
There's so many different things we could talk about.
Yeah.
I would love to ask you a couple closing questions. This idea of being beautifully broken or breaking beautiful. What does it mean to you to be beautifully broken?
I love this question. I mean, the first concept that kind of comes to mind is kintsugi, the Japanese art of fixing broken pottery with gold. And there's also a beautiful book written called The Turning Point. And in this context, when we are faced with looking over the edge, like, what if, this precious, beautiful life could end, which it will for all of us. But I think it's this, it can be, for those who are willing to kind of take it up, this opportunity to say, like, what is the most precious to me? And whether I have 6 months or 6 years or 30 years, like, what do I want to do with my time? And so these moments that break us very, very deeply. I mean, I've, walking alongside my mom, have faced some deep wells of grief of like, what if I lose her to this, horrific, horrendous process that happens in the body, and not to minimize the suffering that anyone goes through in the process of, going through treatments and facing this. And it has made, our relationship and bond so precious, like beyond what I could, imagine as just like a teenage girl, without having to ask these big questions at age 15. And I would not give this cup to anyone to drink from, as far as looking into the face of a diagnosis. And it creates the most magnificent humans that I've met, in my life. It's the people who have actually taken this up and said, I'm going to go forth and actually speak to the stranger on the side of the street and actually be the person that I was here to be and actually use my voice and open that up and share my story like you're doing with this podcast. So
Yeah.
it's one of those wild mysteries of being human
I
and
know.
living in a body that has disease that is very, vulnerable and resilient at the same time. But
we're still here to have fun.
we are still here to have fun. Absolutely. I call them the joy doctors. I tell my patients, I'm like, go find your joy doctors, whether it's your grandkids, whether it's like, playing in the fields, whatever that is for you. Like, those are the best medicine.
Yeah. And then my last question for you is, if you could go back and jump back in a time machine, go back to your young 15-year-old self, and you could give her some advice as you were starting this journey and you were dealing with all these really heavy things at a very young age, what would you say to her?
Wow, that is quite the question. I think I would say lean into mentors more. Like, don't be afraid to go to a mentor and share your story more vulnerably, because I think at that age I was a firstborn child and kind of an overachieving girl, and I thought I just had to get through it on my own and didn't necessarily have a lot of support. My mom moved away for treatments for months at a time, and so I think I internalized a lot of that as overly independent. And I think it's only been in like the last couple of years that I've allowed myself to soften and be held and, have people in my life who are like, yeah, tell me your story. And so if you're an adult in somebody's life, like, be diligent about like pursuing them, in their stories too. Because I think it's not always easy as a young person to ask for help, ask to be seen.
Yeah.
So,
Amen. And where, at least, can people find you if they're needing support, if they want to do a consult, if they want more information about your services?
And the best place is to reach out on my website, drelisesulsernd.com. I have an inquiry form there, and we can hop on a discovery call and chat. I'm also on Instagram, Dr. Elise Sulser ND, on that platform as well. So
beautiful.
Yeah, I'm around and happy to answer questions or point people in the right direction of where they can get somebody who's on board and on their team.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you for being a guest, and we will see you soon in the future.
Thank you so much, Freddie.
Big love.